Hello, and welcome to HMR1. I'm going to adjust the camera just a little bit while we're doing this, while we're talking. HMR1, week 10, lecture 1 of week 10. Yay! Are we down to just one more week left together? We are indeed. And for some, that might be a great sorrow. For others, that might be a great joy, looking at the TAs right now. All right, we this is the week where we ask you to have completed Ismail Bea's book, and we'll be talking today about the Convention on the Rights of the Child, child rights, child soldiers, and also sort of how the United Nations and other non-governmental organizations have sought to expand the human rights idea since its original inception in 1948. So let's just think about what we've been doing since the beginning of this section of human rights, human wrongs. We've examined the origin of the human rights system in the aftermath of the Second World War, not just the horror of the Second World War in terms of casualties and conflict, its terrible impact on the global economy, but also the impact of the Holocaust and other 20th century genocides on the conceptualization of the ultimate crime against humanity of genocide. So emerging from the late 1940s and the beginning of the 1950s is really a consensual statement of what human rights are, sort of the basic terms of these are the basic 30 human rights that we all share as human beings. And those ideas become instantiated in treaty systems, as we talked about previously with Eleanor Roosevelt and the Universal Declaration. That wasn't a treaty. It was a statement of purpose. But what it did do is lay the foundation for further treaties. And these are the Treaty on Civil and Political Rights and the Treaty on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And the idea with these treaties is you as a country, they're negotiated by the international community, under the aegis of the United Nations. They work together really hard to get something that people can agree to, that countries can agree to. It's kind of a consensual or consensus document, right? But they're also forward-looking, right? This is what we really strive for in the future. We need to get there. These are the tools that we'll use to get there. So you have these two great conventions, these two great treaties on civil rights and economic, cultural, and social rights emerging in the 50s and 60s that then are integrated, hopefully, into the law codes of the participating states. And that's how human rights, in a way, are enforced, at least legally, is that the human rights idea becomes manifest in the country's legal system, and we hope in its law enforcement system, right? Now, this is always imperfect. Right? This is a system developed by people. We are not perfect. Right? If we were perfect, we wouldn't need human rights. So, but as time progressed from the 1940s into the 60s and the 70s and even until the 90s, there were growing global calls to not change the basic 30 human rights, but embrace the diplomatic process, this international consensus building process to refine the human rights approach in other fields. We talked about some of this before, like when, to some extent, the elaboration of the Genocide Convention was the first of these. It really carved out this field of modern atrocity and held it up for as a global principle that all states could agree to. Don't commit genocide. Right? That's like, don't be like the Nazis. Right? Don't commit genocide. And so that is why the Genocide Convention went into place, and it complemented other existing laws about crimes against humanity. I mean, at the very root, genocide is murder. And we'd like to think that murder, unlawful killing, is illegal throughout the world. But genocide is much more, right? It's this attempt to erase a people and make it as though they never existed. Right. So other areas that we've seen where this has taken place is, for example, in the development of the refugee idea, creating this modern definition of refugee around the principle of well-founded fear of persecution. And we also talked about some of this with colonialism and decolonization, the making illegal of colonialism, which it's part of this idea of self-determination of peoples, which is one of the ideas in the Universal Declaration, but it builds on that. And it also creates a roadmap for making that system work. So there are two areas, and I'll talk briefly only about one of these areas, but there are two other areas where the global consensus was that the United Nations and the international community and human rights needed to sort of refine their approach. And the first of these is in the area of the relationship between the genders, right? And in this case, we're talking about a very conservative understanding of gender between men and women. Now, the Universal Declaration speaks only of men. Right? Men, perhaps in the generic sense, but as we know, stating everyone and he is the language of the Universal Declaration. Now, that didn't mean that anyone at the time, well, excuse me, I should not say it that way. This didn't mean that someone like Eleanor Roosevelt didn't think that this also applied to women. But you could imagine that the application of the Universal Declaration to women might be disputed, and certainly accounted for the fact that states like Saudi Arabia did not agree to the Universal Declaration. And so the international community through the 60s and into the 70s, really under American leadership, but also leadership from the Scandinavian countries, saw continuing discrimination against women as one of the hurdles for the fullest expression of human rights, but also in terms of protecting civilians, in terms of developing countries. I mean, how can you develop your country if you leave half of the population out of education, out of participation in the workforce, out of leadership? You can't. So this lays the foundation for the first of the two treaties I'm talking about today. This is the 1979 Convention for the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. And it's known by the acronym CEDAW, which doesn't make a lot of sense. We've talked about CERD before in the case of apartheid. It was another international human rights treaty that made racial discrimination illegal and called on the states of the world to end it in their own countries and around the world, including apartheid. And that was called CERD, right? This is called CEDAW. They don't sound any better in French, so we have no hope. So CEDAW, 1979, it reads in part, any distinction, exclusion, or restriction made on the basis of sex, which has the effect or purpose of impairing or nullifying the recognition, enjoyment, or exercise by women, irrespective of their marital status, on a basis of equality of men and women of human rights and fundamental freedoms in the political, economic, social, cultural, civil, or any other field is banned. Right? In other words, you cannot make these distinctions or exclusions. Right? It doesn't matter if the woman is married or single, right? That they are just as entitled to human rights as men. CEDAW was a statement, a restatement of core principles in the UDHR, but in that historical moment, you have to think about why you might want to say this. CEDAW says women have rights. Women have rights. Women have rights because they are human beings, full human beings. And this was restated again, most famously on the 4th Women's Congress in Beijing by Hillary Clinton, where she said, women's rights are human rights and human rights are women's rights. But you have to think, why Why did we have to say as a collection, as collective humanity, that women have rights? And that was because despite all these efforts to achieve human rights, there were continuing discrimination against women throughout the world. And states dissented. Right? The Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women is one of the United Nations international human rights treaties that has among the fewest states agreeing to it. Because the idea was that human rights should stop where people are interacting in terms of their relationships with government, right? That these kinds of discussions of right, about marital status, about equality in divorce, equality in child custody. But this is perhaps going into realms of human life that are outside of the present, but rather by religion and custom. And so this was a statement that no, that kind of boundary is not, cannot be made coherent with the contemporary human rights idea. And this sets up, of course, an ongoing battle between human rights, which are viewed as universal, as applicable to all, regardless of where they are, but also that say, to some extent, are saying to especially those societies and cultures that view, for example, the separation of gender, the discrimination against women in terms of divorce or marriage, or that force people to into jobs and positions or prevent them from owning property because they are women. Right? But that's not acceptable. That's not acceptable. Right? And that culture and religion are not an excuse. You don't have to agree with that. Right? Nothing is forcing anyone to agree or disagree with that. But this is what the international human consensus is, if there is one that is possible, in the form of these treaties. So women have rights, and CEDAW was developed not just to reaffirm that fact, but create a blueprint for nations of the world to follow to close the gap in rights between men and women. And it also committed the United Nations and various other international organizations to that task. So it's been 40 years since the Convention Against Discrimination, the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, and I leave it to you to see where there's been the achievement of equality. I will cite only one very critical area, which is that throughout the developing world, the gap between boys and girls going to school has narrowed as if to be non-existent. Right? In other words, if you look sort of at the entire developing world as a whole, some places it's not so great, other places it's really great. Girls and boys are attending school at the same rate. The further along in education one goes, in many parts of the world, women outnumber men in higher education. And in fact, that's true in the United States. Right? And it's certainly true in human rights studies. All right. So women have rights. But the next treaty that's in the same vein is trying to refine the human rights idea, but also close some gaps. And we're celebrating its 30th anniversary this year, is the Convention on the Rights of the Child. 30th anniversary this year. And the Convention on the Rights of the Child is one of the newest of all human rights treaties. And its very center is in many ways the same statement that the 1979 CEDAW makes about women, which is children are human and they have rights. Children are human and they have rights. But a little bit more. Right? You all were children once, right? Your parents still may view you as children. I hope they don't. But some of us in this room have children, and we know that they are from another planet as far as I'm concerned. But children are human, but they also are special. Right? They must have different kinds of rights in addition to the ones they have. Right? So that's at the core of the Convention of the Rights of the Child. Children are human, they have rights, but children aren't adults. Children are not adults. And so the kinds of rights we have developed for adults may not work for children, and the kinds of expectations we have of adults on behalf of children are different as well. But also, and it had to be said at the time, and it still has to be repeated over and over again, children are not property. They are not the property of their parents. Children are not owned or possessed, even though the language, like, I have kids, right? So, the Convention on the Rights of the Child is built on 4 key principles. The first is the principle of non-discrimination. In other words, that you cannot just say to children, you don't have rights because you're children. Children have rights. The treaty, the convention refines what those rights are, but it says children have rights. They have the right to have rights. Okay. So that's non-discrimination. The second is that government and society must be devoted to the best interest of the child. In other words, when society and government look at children, the thing that should be at the forefront of their collective sort of government mind is, what can we do to make sure that what we do will best help these children? So government, in part, I mean, this is a wonderful idea that I think is missed, and we'll talk more about how it's missed, is that government exists to make sure that kids have the best chance. It's one of the reasons for government. The kids have the best chance, right? That we make sure we know what is in their best, that we can figure out what's in their best interest, and we defend their best interest. So, right, we'll talk about this in a second, what this actually means in practice. The third element is that children have a right to life, survival, and development. Again, children have rights. The right to live, the right to survive, the right to develop. So just like adults who have those rights, the international community and states must protect these rights for children as well, and must take into accommodation that for children, these kinds of rights the exercise of these rights will have a different valence, a different meaning, and require different things of states in order to do so. And the final idea is to have respect for the views of the child. In other words, as appropriate, engage the child so that he or she can claim their rights, to make their interests known. I mean, we've seen wonderful examples of the expression of children's views having an important impact on, before the pandemic, on discussions of climate change, right? Greta, and also the student walkouts that my kids even participated in. So they have a right to express their views and to have their views taken into account when decisions are being made about them, right, or for them. So what does this actually mean in terms of non-discrimination and best interests of the child? I mean, some of the issues within the Convention of the Right to Rights of the Child have a lot to do with things like juvenile justice, right? Which is not to treat children the same way you would treat adults in a judicial system. And it also bans the use of the death penalty for children. International human rights law bans the use of the death penalty, period, but at least this gets states that may not adhere to that to try to adhere to it for children. It also means that children must have labor rights. In other words, they cannot be worked like adults. And this was, in fact, a human rights issue that predates many human rights discussions about the treatment of children in labor in the United States and England. And finally, that children under the age of 18, although this had to be figured out more, and we'll talk about this in a second, should not be soldiers. Children have the right not to be soldiers, and certainly not to be impressed or conscripted into the military. So what does this mean, sort of best interest mean? So one of the areas where this is common in America, in the United States, is in determination of child custody. of child custody issues. And this is a complex and convoluted discussion, and rightly so, because it's very hard sometimes to figure out what might be in the best interest of the child. So in that case, the state takes into account not the wants and desires of parents, but rather the needs of children. And while they may seek to balance those ideas, what must be preeminent is what is best for the child. Now, this could extend, and I think this is interesting to think about, the best interests of children may extend to a whole range of social policy issues in education, in healthcare. But I'm also often thinking about climate in this sense. Like, what are the climate change itself is not generations away. It's happening now, but decisions being made now are definitely not in the best interest of children. And that's where the views of the children come in, the right of children to express themselves, the right of children to speak and be heard is part of it. So the Convention on Rights of the Child is a really far-ranging, far-reaching treaty. But the area where there was the most controversy about it, or where it was seen to be not working as effectively as it could, was in the prevention of children being put into the military. And that's because even some European states recruit children as young as 16. And you don't think, oh, that's not a child, that's a teenager, right? But 16-year-olds, 17-year-olds are easily exploited in military service, and they're like many of you. Your brains are still forming. Your ideas about the world are still there. Your ability to make decisions is not what it should be. One would hope to participate in war. So, in 2020, this year actually, the optional protocol of the Convention on the Rights of the Child goes into effect. Now, what is an optional protocol? An optional protocol is like an addendum to the treaty. So you've got the treaty issues that people can agree to. They can agree to the optional protocol. We've already talked about this with the Refugee Convention, right? The 1967 protocol. So the 2020 protocol is now international law in terms of child soldiers, and it was brought into being not because governments became interested in this issue, because I think governments were not so interested in this issue, but rather because 6 major human rights non-governmental organizations built a coalition to advocate for it. And these are the Big 6, they're sometimes called. The Quakers, Save the Children, Human Rights Watch, the International Federation, or Fédération Internationale de Terre de Hommes, the International Federation of the Land of People. It's a French NGO, Jesuit Relief Society, and Amnesty International. And they all began to pressure the United Nations to work with member states to bring about reform in the field of child soldiers. Remember, Ismail Beah was a child soldier after the Convention on the Rights of the Child was signed by Sierra Leone. Just saying, right? So it wasn't really working super well. So the idea is to try to make it work better with the 2020 protocol. And now, excuse me, let me just chug some tea. There are 2 key elements of the 2020 protocol. I mean, it's a long treaty with all sorts of goals and reporting mechanisms in it. But the one is the one and perhaps the most important element of it is it asks states to adopt what's called the Straight 18. Straight 18. I didn't make this up. So Straight 18 means that no children, no one under the age of 18 is either recruited or can volunteer for military service. Right? So nope, no one in our military is under 18, and certainly no one doing any of the fighting is under 18. Right? So the idea is that if the entire world just says 18 is our basis, right? It'll make it easier to enforce and track, and states that try to claim, oh, this person is 17 going on 18, that won't work. So the idea is for the world to embrace this basic standard of straight 18. 18 is not the bottom limit in the United States, right? With permission, parents' permission and so on, one can join the military when one is 17. So this is part of the optional protocol, and in fact, the optional protocol of the Convention of the Rights of the Child is among the most widely accepted international human rights treaties. Virtually all states that could agree to it have agreed to it. There's some criticism of it from the International Red Cross, which monitors compliance with the Geneva Conventions, mostly that a lot of the treaty uses language like, we should do this where feasible, right? It's a wiggle word to get people out of doing it. So I want to begin to end. The Convention of the Rights of the Child has been signed and ratified by every country in the world that can do so, and even some that can't, like Palestine, except one country, and that's the United States. The United States Senate, which has to approve treaties, has refused to pass or affirm President Clinton's signature. This was done in 1995. Bubba signed the Convention of the Rights of the Child. And it just sat there in the US Senate and has been blocked primarily by conservative Republican senators, you know the story, ever since. And I find this shameful, absolutely shameful. And the objection is primarily raised by conservative religious constituents, primarily evangelical Christians and conservative Jewish communities, that the Convention of the Rights of the Child could lead to state interference in parental rights. You know, the state should interfere in parental rights if those parents are abusing their children, right? I mean, that's one of the jobs of the state regardless, and already the job of the state. But it's a kind of a fear that this is the leading edge, if you will, of a broader attempt to disconnect children from a religious upbringing and force a kind of secular upbringing on them. It's completely without base, right? There's no basis for this, right? And so that's one of the reasons why the United States has not signed it. But I think the other is that signing it would increase pressure on a really broad amount of reform within the American justice system, juvenile justice system, which is not in compliance with the Convention on the Rights of the Child. I mean, we see it, right? We see little kids being handcuffed to deaths. We see kids killed in encounters with police. I mean, since 2008, 140 children, including Tamir Rice, have been murdered or killed by the police. But where the United States is out of complete compliance is in the enormous poverty rate facing children in America. Almost half of all American children live close to or below the poverty line. Almost all major American urban school districts, the majority of children are on free or reduced lunch, a very good measure of poverty. So I think a broader fear is that compliance with the Convention of the Rights of the Child will lay bare how poorly the United States has been able to affirm and uphold the rights of children. So one of the things that a group of human rights studies program directors and I are doing is that we are hoping to use the restart of the Biden administration to ask the US Senate to re-engage with the possibility of affirming this treaty, in the hopes that it will begin to bring to light many of the concerns that we have about the treatment of children in the United States. And I certainly hope this might be a campaign that any of you will be willing to help support as well. All right, we will now go back to Ismail Bea and enjoy one of his Moth Radio Hour talk and then have questions. Thank you.